Ara's hand shot out, fist bunching the expensive wool of Han Yiwook's lapel. She jerked him forward, forcing his towering frame down until his ear was inches from her lips. "Don't move your head," she hissed, her voice a sharp contrast to her simple delivery uniform. "There's a sniper on the clock tower. Your right-hand man just signaled the green light with his cufflink. Lean into me or you're a dead man." Yiwook's hand clamped onto her waist, a reflex of power, but the concrete pillar behind them exploded in a spray of stone dust where his chest had been a heartbeat ago. The battered delivery van screeched away from the plaza, the scent of burnt rubber masking the metallic tang of the bullet that had nearly claimed Han Yiwook's life. Ara gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her eyes darting between the side mirrors and the road ahead with a predatory focus. Beside her, Yiwook sat in the cramped passenger seat, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the stained upholstery. He didn't look like a man who had just escaped death. He looked like a man calculating the cost of a betrayal. "You're driving a 5-speed manual with synchronized rev matching," Yiwook said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. He didn't look at her. He watched the speedometer. "Most delivery drivers grind the gears in a panic. You haven't missed a shift once." Ara didn't flinch. She took a hard right, the tires chirping as she navigated a narrow alleyway to break the line of sight from the main road. "I like to take care of my vehicle, Mr. Han. It's my livelihood." "Don't lie to me. Not after you just saved me from my own brother-in-arms." He finally turned his head, his sharp jawline tight. The gold light of the passing street lamps flickered across his face, highlighting the cold intensity in his eyes. "You identified a cold-bore sniper position at 300 yards in low light. You recognized a silent signal from a man you've never met. And now, you're performing a standard counter-surveillance box pattern to see if we're being followed." Ara felt the weight of his gaze, a physical pressure that demanded the truth. She reached up, pulling her baseball cap lower over her eyes. "Maybe I just watch a lot of movies." Yiwook's hand shot out not to strike, but to grab the tactical glove she had pulled from the side door, a habit she'd forgotten to hide. He turned it over, seeing the reinforced padding and the wear on the trigger finger. "These are issued to the 707th Special Missions Group. They haven't been in circulation for 3 years. He leaned closer, his scent of expensive cedarwood and cold rain filling the small cabin. "Who are you, Yoon Ara?" "Because delivery girl doesn't cover the way you're scanning for a secondary shooter." The silence in the van was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine. Ara realized then that the mask was gone. She couldn't go back to being invisible. She exhaled, a long, weary sound. "I'm a ghost, Mr. Han, just like you're about to be if we don't switch cars in the next 2 minutes. Minseok didn't just hire a shooter, he hired Park Do-hyun. If Do-hyun is on the trigger, he's already calculated our exit route." Yiwook's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his stoic features. "You know the sniper's name." "I trained him," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "And I'm the only reason you're still breathing." The air inside the glass-walled boardroom of the Gumryang headquarters was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the metallic, underlying tang of ozone from the silent air purifiers. Kang Minseok stood at the head of the obsidian table, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over the empty seat that had belonged to Han Yiwook for a decade. He adjusted his cufflink, the same one he had used to signal the sniper, with a slow, rhythmic deliberation. He didn't feel like a traitor. He felt like an heir finally claiming his birthright. The heavy double doors swung open, and the syndicate's top captains filed in, their faces masks of confusion and suppressed terror. Behind them stood Madame Seo Hyrin, a vision in bone-white silk that stood out against the dark wood of the room like a blade. She didn't sit. She simply leaned against the far wall, her cold, elegant smile signaling that the transition of power had already been bought and paid for. "Yiwook is dead," Minseok announced, his voice booming with a false gravity that brooked no question. "An ambush at the plaza. We were outmaneuvered." A low murmur rippled through the room. Elder Park, a man who had served Yiwook's father, stood up, his hand trembling slightly. "Dead? Without a body? Yiwook is not a man who vanishes into the night, Minseok. We need confirmation before we discuss succession." Minseok didn't argue. He didn't have to. He looked at the guards stationed at the perimeter of the room, men he had personally vetted and promoted over the last 6 months. With a slight nod, the air in the room changed. The silent professionalism of the syndicate dissolved into raw, calculated violence. 2 guards stepped forward, their silenced pistols coughing twice. Elder Park collapsed back into his leather chair, a crimson bloom spreading across his white dress shirt. The other captains froze, the realization hitting them like a physical blow. This wasn't an announcement, it was a purge. "The old ways died with Yiwook," Minseok said, stepping over the threshold of the throne and finally sitting in the master's chair. He looked at Madame Seo, who inclined her head in a silent toast. "Loyalty is no longer a suggestion. It is a requirement for survival. Anyone who remembers the previous administration too fondly will find themselves joining them by morning." Outside the window, the neon lights of Seoul pulsed like a fever. Minseok watched his reflection in the glass, the scar across his eyebrow jagged and dark. He had the seat, the guards, and the backing of the most powerful woman in the underworld. He had won. But as he gripped the armrests of the chair, he couldn't shake the memory of the delivery girl's eyes, the way she had moved with a grace that wasn't civilian. He had sent a sniper, but he hadn't seen a body. And in this world, if there was no body, there was no peace. The van wound through the narrow, skeletal ribs of an industrial district until the city's neon glow was a mere bruise on the horizon. Ara pulled into a derelict warehouse that smelled of rusted iron and stagnant salt. With practiced efficiency, she bypassed a faulty security gate and led Yiwook into a subterranean basement concealed behind a false wall of rotted plywood. The room was a time capsule. Dust motes danced in the beam of a single, flickering halogen bulb, illuminating a steel locker, a military-grade radio, and a stack of topographical maps. This was a dead drop, a sanctuary for a soldier who no longer officially existed. Yiwook moved through the cramped space, his presence making the walls feel smaller. He ran a finger over the cold steel of an empty rifle rack. "You were Ghost Unit," he said, his voice echoing in the damp air. "The specialized sniper division they claim was disbanded 5 years ago." Ara dropped her baseball cap onto a crate, her hair falling in messy waves. She didn't look like a delivery girl anymore. She looked like a veteran. "They didn't disband us. They just moved us further into the shadows. We were the scalpels for the things the government didn't want to get their hands dirty with." She reached into the locker and pulled out a tattered photograph of a young woman holding a child. She handed it to him. "That was my last target, a whistleblower's wife. I was positioned on a rooftop in Incheon, my eye pressed to the glass, waiting for the green light. The order came through my headset. Confirm target, eliminate witness." Ara's voice went flat, the emotion drained out by the weight of the memory. "I saw the way she held her daughter's hand. I saw the grocery bag she was carrying. I didn't pull the trigger. I walked away from the post, smashed my comms, and vanished. They labeled me a traitor, scrubbed my records, and put a burn notice on my file. That's why I was delivering your food, Mr. Han. It's hard to be a ghost when you have a conscience." Yiwook looked from the photo to Ara. For the first time, the coldness in his eyes softened into something resembling respect. He understood the cost of a clean soul in a filthy world. "You chose a life of poverty over a life of sanctioned murder," he noted. "I chose to sleep at night," she replied, her gaze hardening as she looked toward the door. "But now Minseok has hired Du Hyun. He was my junior, the one who took the shot I wouldn't. He doesn't have a conscience, and he won't stop until he finishes what he started at the plaza." Yiwook stepped toward her, his shadow merging with hers. "Then we don't hide anymore. We hunt." The silence of the safe house was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic chirping, not from Ara's old military radio, but from Yiwook's encrypted phone. He pulled it from his pocket, his brow furrowing as a single image flickered onto the screen. A live feed of the very warehouse they were standing in, captured from a drone hovering hundreds of feet above. Below the image, a text string appeared. "White looks better on you than blood, Yiwook." "Madame Seo," Yiwook spat, the name tasting like poison. "She didn't just back the coup. She's been tracking the signal footprint of my emergency biometric override." "We're burnt," Ara said, her voice already shifting into the cold, clipped tone of a mission commander. She grabbed a tactical bag, throwing in the radio and a spare sidearm. "The perimeter is breached. Move." They burst out of the warehouse just as 3 black SUVs roared onto the gravel lot, their headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of predators. Ara didn't head for her delivery van. It was too slow, a death trap. Instead, she sprinted toward a tarpaulin-covered shape in the corner of the lot. She ripped the cover away to reveal a modified matte black sedan, a remnant of her ghost unit days she'd kept maintained for a night she hoped would never come. "Drive," Yiwook commanded, sliding into the passenger seat as Ara floored the accelerator. The car lunged forward, fishtailing through the gravel before catching grip on the asphalt of the industrial road. Behind them, the SUVs pivoted with synchronized precision. A sunroof slid open on the lead vehicle, and a man emerged with a submachine gun. "Keep it steady," Yiwook said, his voice eerily calm despite the roar of the engine. He reached into the backseat, pulling a briefcase that unfolded into a high-caliber folding rifle. He rolled down the window, the freezing night air whipping his dark hair across his face. The world became a blur of screeching tires and muzzle flashes. Ara drove with a terrifying, fluid geometry, weaving through the pillars of an elevated highway to disrupt the shooter's line of sight. She didn't look back. She trusted the man beside her. Yiwook leaned out into the slipstream, his movements as precise as a surgeon. Pop, pop. The lead SUV's front tire disintegrated, sending the vehicle into a violent barrel roll that blocked the path of the second pursuer. "One more left," Ara shouted over the wind, her eyes locked on the rearview mirror. "And he's gaining." "He's not just gaining," Yiwook replied, reloading with a metallic click. "He's hurting us. There's a blockade 2 miles up." Ara's jaw set. She shifted into 5th gear, the engine screaming in protest. "Then we stop playing by the road's rules. Hold on." She didn't hit the brakes. Instead, she aimed the car straight for the steep, concrete embankment of the drainage canal, a move so suicidal it made even the stoic Mafia boss tighten his grip on the rifle. They were no longer just running. They were descending into the belly of the city, where only ghosts knew the way. The car bottomed out with a bone-jarring thud as they hit the concrete floor of the dry docks, the echoes of the engine bouncing off the rusted hulls of skeletonized ships. Ara killed the lights, plunging them into a world of deep shadows and the smell of brine and rotting metal. But the darkness was no sanctuary. A single, rhythmic pulse of a red laser dot danced across the dashboard, settling briefly on Ara's heart before flicking to Yiwook's forehead. "Out, now!" Ara commanded, her voice a low vibration. They rolled from the moving car just as a high-velocity round punched through the windshield, shattering the glass into 1,000 diamonds. They took cover behind a massive, rusted shipping container. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Ara closed her eyes, counting the seconds between the wind's gusts. She knew this rhythm. 3 seconds to breathe, 2 to adjust for windage, 1 to squeeze. "Do Hyun," Ara's voice rang out, bouncing off the steel walls of the shipyard. "Stop! It's the Raven. I know you're on the trigger. I know you're counting the heartbeat." The laser dot vanished. A long silence stretched, filled only by the distant groaning of a crane. Then, a voice crackled from a speaker somewhere in the rafters, amplified and hollow. "Raven is dead. She was a traitor who lost her nerve in Incheon." "I didn't lose my nerve, Do Hyun. I found my soul," Ara shouted, her back pressed against the cold metal, eyes locked with Yiwook's. He was watching her, his hand on his sidearm, seeing the raw pain of a mentor facing her protege. "They're using you. You're the disposable pawn in Minseok's coup. Do you think Madame Seo lets witnesses live? Once Yiwook is down, you're the next loose end." "I have an order," the voice replied, but there was a flicker of hesitation, a microsecond of drag in his speech that Ara had trained him to eliminate. "You have a choice," Ara countered. "Check your encrypted channel. Look at the payout routing. It's a dead man's switch. The moment you confirm the kill, your own extraction team is authorized to sanitize the nest. They aren't coming to pick you up, Do Hyun. They're coming to bury you." A heavy silence descended again. Yiwook leaned closer to Ara, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "Can you flip him?" "I taught him everything he knows," she whispered back, her eyes glistening. "Including how to spot a betrayal." High above, a metal grate creaked. The laser dot reappeared, but it wasn't on them. It flickered toward the entrance of the shipyard, where the headlights of Madame Sio's approaching SUVs began to crest the hill. "3 targets approaching from the north," Du Hyun's voice came back, stripped of its mechanical coldness. "Moving to secondary position. You have 2 minutes, Sunby. Don't make me regret this." The transition from the shadows of the shipyard to the opulent, blinding gold of the Grand Hyatt ballroom was a jarring descent into a different kind of war. Ara had traded her delivery cap for a backless silk gown the color of midnight, its sleek lines hiding a ceramic blade strapped to her thigh, and a signal jammer disguised as a diamond clutch. Beside her, Yi-wook looked every bit the resurrected king in a tuxedo that cost more than most people made in a year. His presence was a calculated gamble. They weren't here to hide, they were here to haunt. "The gala is a celebration of the merger," Yi-wook murmured, his lips barely moving as they swept through the crowd. "Min Seok is publicly sealing his deal with Madame Seo tonight. He's already moved the syndicate's liquid assets into her offshore accounts. If we don't get that ledger, he doesn't just have my chair. He has the immunity that her political connections provide." "I see the server room access," Ara whispered, her eyes scanning the room with tactical precision. "Northwest corner, behind the catering curtain. Madame Seo's biometrics are the only key, but her digital signature is mirrored on her tablet. If I can get within 10 feet of her for 60 seconds, I can clone the frequency." Madame Seo was a pillar of white light in the center of the room, laughing softly as Min Seok stood at her side, beaming with the misplaced confidence of a man who thought he had already won. Yi-wook's hand tightened on Ara's waist, a grounding force in the sea of sharks. "I'll provide the distraction. You play the ghost." Yi-wook stepped into the light. The room went cold. Conversations died like guttering candles as the dead boss walked toward his traitorous right hand. Min Seok's glass shattered on the marble floor, his face draining of color until he looked like a ghost himself. "You look like you've seen a spirit, Min Seok," Yi-wook said, his voice a low, terrifying hum that carried across the ballroom. While the room's gravity shifted toward the confrontation, Ara became a shadow. She drifted past Madame Seo, her clutch brushing against the woman's silk wrap. On her wrist, a hidden LED flickered from red to green. 10%, 40, 80. Madame Seo's eyes flicked to Ara, a spark of recognition igniting in her cold gaze, but Yi-wook stepped forward, blocking her line of sight. "We have much to discuss, madam. Starting with the embezzlement records your new partner forgot to mention." Ara slipped behind the velvet curtain, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tapped her earpiece. "I have the signature. Entering the vault now." "Be quick," Yi-wook's voice crackled back, steady despite the guns she knew were being leveled at him under the tables. "The dragon is awake, but the cage is closing fast." The digital extraction was 98% complete when the air in the server room shifted. Ara didn't look up from the terminal. She felt the cold press of a suppressor against the base of her skull. The smell was unmistakable, gun oil and expensive, treachery-scented cologne. "The ghost finally gets caught in the light," Min Seok whispered, his voice jagged with desperate rage. He didn't wait for her to move. He backhanded her with the grip of his pistol, the world splintering into a haze of white pain as he dragged her toward the service elevator. In the ballroom, the standoff had reached a fever pitch. Yi-wook stood motionless, surrounded by Madame Seo's security, his eyes locked on the balcony above. The heavy gold curtains parted, and Min Seok appeared, holding a battered, bloodied Ara by the throat. He forced her onto her knees at the edge of the railing. "Drop the drive, Yi-wook," Min Seok roared, his composure finally shattered. The captains watched in stunned silence as the man they thought was their new leader unraveled. "Give me the biometric override and the ledger, or she dies. Right here, right now." Madame Seo stepped back, her white silk dress shimmering like a shroud. She watched with clinical interest. "A choice, Yi-wook," she purred. "The empire you built with blood, or the girl who delivers your dinner. Which one is worth more to the Dragon of Soul?" Yi-wook looked at Ara. Her lip was split, and her midnight blue gown was torn at the shoulder, but her eyes were steady, clear, and tactical even in the face of death. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. Don't. Yiwook's hand tightened around the small, silver drive containing the evidence of Minseok's theft. For years, he had lived for the syndicate. He had traded his sleep, his youth, and his humanity for the throne he now stood before. But as he looked at Ara, he realized the throne was just a chair in an empty room, and she was the first person in a decade who had seen him as a man instead of a monument. "You want the chair, Minseok?" Yiwook's voice was a low, resonant bell that silenced the room. He held the drive over the edge of a decorative fountain, the water swirling below. "It's a heavy thing to sit in alone." "The drive, Yiwook, now." "Let her go," Yiwook commanded, his gaze turning into something ancient and terrifying. "Take the money, take the name, take the empire. If a single hair on her head is harmed after this moment, I won't just kill you. I will erase every trace that you ever existed." He opened his hand. The drive hit the water with a soft splash. In that moment, Han Yiwook was no longer a king. He was a man choosing a life over a legend, crossing a bridge from which there was no turning back. The transition from the ballroom to the shipping docks was a blur of rain and jagged adrenaline. Minseok, fueled by a manic desperation, shoved Ara toward the edge of the pier where a getaway boat bobbed in the dark, churning water. He still held the gun to her head, but his eyes were darting toward the shadows, terrified of the man he had just stripped of an empire. "It's over, Minseok." Yiwook's voice emerged from the mist, calm and hollow. He stood in the center of the pier, unarmed. His hands raised in a gesture of surrender that felt more like an executioner's patience. "You have the drive. You have the seat. Let her go." "I don't have peace," Minseok screamed, the rain slicking his hair against his scarred brow. "As long as you're breathing, I'm just a placeholder." In the silence that followed, a familiar red dot appeared. It didn't settle on Yiwook. It danced across Minseok's chest. Park Du-hyun was in position, but he wasn't firing. The sniper was frozen in the paradox Ara had planted, waiting for a signal that would never come from a master who had already betrayed him. Ara felt the pressure of the pistol barrel waver as Minseok's hand began to shake. This was the opening she had trained for. With a sudden, violent twist, she slammed her elbow into Minseok's solar plexus and dropped to the wet wood. As Minseok gasped, she didn't run for Yiwook. She ran for the long, heavy case Du-hyun had stashed near the crane, the backup rifle. She skidded across the slick planks, her fingers finding the cold steel of the bolt action. In one fluid motion, she chambered around and dropped into a prone position. The world narrowed to the diameter of the glass. The rain, the wind, the salt, everything faded until there was only the target. She didn't aim for Minseok's heart. She aimed for the weapon in his hand. Crack! The shot was a whip crack in the dark. Minseok's pistol shattered, the force spinning him around as he cried out in shock. Before he could recover, Ara shifted the barrel slightly higher, her eye locked onto the distant silhouette of the crane where Du-hyun sat. She fired a second shot, not at the boy she had trained, but at the light fixture above his head. Glass rained down on him, a tactical shut-down signal. "Drop the glass, Du-hyun," Ara shouted, her voice carrying over the crashing waves. "The war is finished." A moment later, a rifle clattered to the metal floor of the crane's nest. Minseok fell to his knees, clutching his mangled hand, the ghost of his ambition dissolving into the rain. Yiwook walked past him without a word, his eyes only on Ara. She stood up slowly, the heavy rifle still in her hands, her shadow long and sharp against the docks. For the first time, she wasn't a ghost or a delivery girl. She was the shield that it held. The roar of the shipyard was silenced by a single, blinding flash that turned the midnight sky into a searing orange noon. The fuel lines of the getaway boat, rigged with Ara's tactical precision, detonated in a sequence that tore through the pier, sending a wall of fire and debris into the black waters below. To the sirens screaming in the distance and the cameras of the news helicopters circling above, the story was simple. The Dragon of Soul had gone down in flames with his betrayer, leaving behind nothing but scorched wood and the setting sun of an empire. But beneath the chaos of the smoke, two shadows moved toward a nondescript white van parked a mile down the coast. 3 years later, the air didn't smell of cordite or wet pavement, but of roasting coffee beans and the sharp, clean salt of the East Sea. In a quiet coastal village where the mountains dipped their toes into the water, a small cafe stood with its doors propped open to the morning breeze. There were no obsidian glass walls here, no silent men with earpieces, and no red dots dancing on the walls. Han Yi-wook, dressed in a simple linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, moved with a different kind of stillness now. The gravity that used to bend around him had softened. The lethal edge of his jaw was hidden behind a smile as he handed a steaming cup to a local fisherman. He wasn't a king anymore, and he found he liked the weight of a ceramic mug far better than the weight of a syndicate. Ara sat at a small wooden table in the corner, her baseball cap replaced by a sun hat, her eyes no longer scanning the horizon for snipers, but watching a toddler with Yi-wook's eyes chase a seagull across the sand. The mysterious incident of her past was a story from a different life, a ghost that had finally been laid to rest. Yi-wook walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder, not a tactical grab to save a life, but a gentle touch to anchor one. He leaned down, his voice a low, warm velvet that no longer carried the chill of the underworld. "The delivery arrived," he whispered into her ear, a playful echo of the night they met. Ara looked up at him, the sunlight catching the gold in her eyes. Was it the coffee beans or the flour? "Neither," he replied, looking out at their daughter and the endless blue of the horizon. "It was the peace we were promised." Outside, the waves hummed a steady, peaceful rhythm. The world thought the dragon was dead, and in a way, it was right. The man who owned the city was gone, replaced by a man who finally owned himself. They were just two ghosts who had found a way to stop haunting their lives and start living them, disappearing not into the shadows, but into the light.